So we begin today week two of a class on universal basic income experiments. I should say, by the way, I think this is the first time anyone anywhere has taught a class in UBI experiments. I don't know if that's true, but it's the first one I know of. So a note, first of all, a note on terminology. Universal basic income is the term most commonly used for giving income to everybody, regardless of anything, regardless of whether they're in a family or whether they're single, regardless of they work or not, and also specifically regardless of other income that they might have. Negative income tax is like the universal basic income, except that it is given only to people who have low income. Oh, by the way, while I'm lecturing, I'm allowed to take this off. So it is given only to people who have low income, and then it phases out as your income goes up. That's in the book, but I just want to make sure we get that chapter out. We get these definitions out. The terms basic income guarantee, guaranteed income, guaranteed annual income, minimum income guarantee, livable income for everyone, many other terms are also used to mean usually either one of these programs. There is no widely accepted branch term that says, well, what do we have for the set that includes universal basic income and NIT? We have instead all these many different terms for it. But understand those terms usually to mean other things. Oh, also one thing I forgot to say, make sure to silence your cell phones if you haven't already. And that's another thing to remind me of when I begin class, remind me to silence phones. So I am in this class, since you're all masters in economics, I'm assuming you know something about statistics and econometrics. We will not discuss regression analysis, traditional data problems like covariance, but we will be discussing more critically how to use the data you found from econometrics and how to gather that data, and whether and we're kind of skipping that middle step of doing the econometrics. We're going about what kind of data are you choosing to use, and then you use all your econometrics, you get this output. How are you using that output? We're discussing the things around econometrics without directly discussing very much econometrics at all. Now, but one thing I will say about econometrics and statistics is I'm going to make sure you know these definitions because they come up a lot. The definitions of accuracy and bias. Accuracy is an estimator that has a small variance. The smaller the variance is, as long as the true value is very likely to fall in the confidence interval. The smaller the confidence interval, that is a more accurate estimate. But accuracy is not the same thing as unbiased. Unbiased is that the average of all the estimates that you will get is the same as, it's likely anyway, to be the same as the actual estimate, the average of the estimates that you're likely to get. On average, you are just as likely to overestimate as underestimate the outcome if it is unbiased. So a bias here has nothing to do with how we're used to understanding it, which is which is groups, inside groups having bias against outside groups. That's not the kind of bias we're talking about here. We're talking a biased estimator. That is one that if it was more likely to underestimate or than the true value, then it's biased in the underestimate direction, or it might biased towards overestimating something. We will talk a great deal about bias because many of the results you get in basic income experiments are in fact biased. But I should also say that bias is not all there is to a statistic. Accuracy is as important, or sometimes more important, than bias. Sometimes you would prefer an accurate, something that is, you would prefer a bias estimate to an unbiased estimate if it's more accurate, if it has a smaller variance. So suppose, let's see, suppose, what would be a good example? Well, suppose the true value is 50, and you got one estimate that is likely to put it at, say, 49. Or it's usually going to be between, say, what's usually going to come up, if the true value is 50, it's probably going to say it's between, say, 47 and 51. It's on average, it's going to be underestimate more than it's going to overestimate. But it's pretty accurate. You're pretty close to that 50. Suppose you have another one that's completely unbiased. However, if it's 50, your range of what your estimate might be anywhere from 10 to 90. Completely accurate, completely unbiased, but very inaccurate. In that case, you prefer the biased estimate. Now, but very often we're going to be dealing with estimates that are both biased and not very accurate, biased in a way that makes them less accurate. Also, I should mention what is and is not an experiment. The definition of an experiment in the book is the effort to try out a policy on a small scale to learn something about it in advance of full implementation. So policies are not experiments. The Alaska dividend, which has been giving out something like a basic income, it's arguably is a basic income for the last 40 years, is not an experiment. That's a policy. Every Alaskan gets it. It's not put there for the purpose of study. The American experiment with a type of democracy that has a president and a Congress and a Supreme Court, that's not an experiment. It's not an experiment in the sense we're using it. That's a policy. The Russian experiment with communism that ended in the early 90s, that's not an experiment in the sense we're using. An experiment is something done on a small scale. You try it out to learn something, to maybe you're going to try it on a larger scale. Now, some people object to, but in other terms, what I'm saying is that anything that you try out on a small scale before actually implementing is a form of experiment. There are some people who object to that broad of a definition. They want the definition to be even narrower. And they will say that an experiment has to be a random control experiment of the type where you have a control group and you have an experimental group and you have a sample size large enough to control for lots of statistical factors. That's a random control trial, an RCT. The people who insist that's the only kind of experiment are sometimes called randomistas. If you're not randomizing, you're not experimenting. And random control trials are very good when they're possible. But very often when you're dealing with a social science experiment, there are many things that random control trials cannot test. And you can use something else, such as a saturation study. A saturation study where your control group will be one town and your experimental group will be another town. That is a saturation study. Or your control group might well just be a town, and then your experimental group might be the town, and then your control group is really all the other towns that you just happen to have data on. All the other towns put together, looking at this town. Now, if you have two towns and you randomly assign which town is going to get the treatment and which town is going to be the control group, in that sense, you have random assignment. But you don't have enough random assignment to account for differences between the two towns. Even if you flip a coin to say, well, this town gets the basic income, that one doesn't. Well, suppose you give this town the basic income and not that one, but in that one, then the largest employer in that town just goes out of business and everybody loses their jobs. And you say, oh, well, if you don't have basic income, it causes you to lose your job. Well, actually, no, it was because there just happened to be this big employer that just happened to go out of business. A saturation study can't control for that. And so its results are not going to be as statistically reliable as an RCT, but a saturation study can measure things that an RCT cannot begin to measure. So sometimes for some things, saturation studies are better. For some things, RCTs are better. But RCTs, I don't believe, should be thought of as the only true experiment because they can't do everything. An ideal experiment would mix the two, but then you'd need like 50 towns to get the UBI and 50 towns to not get the UBI, and that's going to be prohibitively expensive in most cases, not in all. Now, other terms that are commonly used instead of experiment are pilot, a pilot project, test, and trial. But all of them have some problems of what to call them. Pilot project, it's not clear if a pilot project has to be controlled, needs a control group or not. And it's unclear, sometimes pilot project implies that it's being conducted by the government that has already decided to implement the policy, at least if the pilot goes well. So what exactly qualifies as a pilot is also a contested term, I think. Now, I think a test is probably the worst of these terms because a test implies there is some criteria which you're going to pass or fail. They all sort of imply this, but a test most implies that. And usually that's not what social science experiments can do. They cannot give them a passing or a failing grade. I very often prefer to use the simplest of all these terms, trial. All of these things we're studying, whether you can argue, are they experiments or not? Are they trials or not? Are they tests or not? But are they experiments or not? Are they pilots or not? Are they tests or not? But unarguably, they're all trials. You're trying it out. All experiments are trials. Maybe not all trials are experiments. I don't know. So another statistical issue that we have to deal with is sample size. You need a sample size that is large enough for the law of large numbers to kick in, to make it very unusual for the average of the number of people you're dealing with to equal to very rarely will it not be pretty close to the true average. And the law of large numbers actually begins to kick in around 20 observations. For you to flip a coin 20 times in a row, it's very unusual that you're going to get 17 heads and 3 tails. And when you get to 50, you're going to get a very small variance around about 25 of each. Usually, in rare circumstances, you won't. And so it collapsed. The law of large numbers, then it does actually get small pretty quickly, and so that makes it sound like, oh, well, then we could just run a basic income experiment with 50 people. Well, you could, depending on what it is you're looking for, but maybe you want to see how does it affect men and how does it affect women? Now you need 100 people. What if you want to find out how does it affect the divorce rate? Well, how many couples out of 50 couples are likely to get divorced in a given year? Probably one or two. So actually, if you want to find out how it affects the divorce rate, you would need that one or two to grow up to be about 50 people. So then so you need to multiply by 50. So instead of 50 people, now you need 2,500 people. So the sample size blows up really quickly when you want to look at all these factors. How does it affect your likelihood to do this? So for a lot of the things that we would want to know about basic income, we would need a sample size well into the thousands. And a lot of the experiments that we're having are actually much smaller. So let me talk about some of the difficulties of testing. The difficulties of testing UBI under experimental circumstances. The first and biggest to talk about is community effects, which are also called feedback effects. I talked about this on the first day, that a UBI is not like a vaccine. A vaccine affects your body and your body only. If it's safe, and if you test it on 1,000 people, if it's safe and effective on these 1,000 people, we know everything we want to know about this vaccine. There's no interaction problem. You say, well, if you're vaccinated, if we're not looking at interactions, when we're looking, is this vaccine safe and effective? We're just looking at how does it affect the individual. But if you want to look at how does UBI affect the likelihood that somebody's going to work so many hours a week, that depends on the interaction of this worker with their employer, and then the employer's interaction back with the worker. But it also affects different workers, how workers interact with each other. If everybody in the country has a UBI, and then all of them said, well, we're going to work a little bit less because there's a UBI, that's likely to drive up wages. And then wages, in turn, are going to drive people back into the labor force. So it's actually, you would expect from the community effects a greater income, a greater effect on a person's income, and a smaller effect on their number of hours worked. If the market works the way we usually do, would affect that because of community effects. You will not find that at all with a random control trial. You might find a little bit of that in a saturation study, but a saturation study only studies workers in one little town. But those workers in that town of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people are competing with workers all over the country. How UBI works when one town has it is going to have a less impact on employers than if everybody in the country has it. So even a saturation study will not tell you that. That means that when we look at the response of the labor market, because we're only looking at the shift in demand, we're going to overestimate the decline in hours. So it's going to be bias it's going to have all of these biases. It's going to overestimate the decline in work hours, overestimate the cost of the program in terms of government spending. It's going to overestimate the so-called efficiency loss. It's going to underestimate the effect on the income of beneficiaries and underestimate the effect of the well-being of beneficiaries. And let me actually share screen on that. Now, I've never tried to share screen while I'm using something like this. So I'll see how this is going to work. Let's see. Okay, let's see. What if I just move this over here? Is that going to do anything? No.
Do you want to share your screen, right?
Yeah, I know how to share a screen, but I've not done it when I'm using two different screens. So let's see. It's also because I have to go and then look at that screen in order to make it work. All right. Wow. Okay, this is not easy. Okay, there's a typical supply and demand graph. And what we are doing is measuring only this horizontal shift from A to B with no change in wages, because there's no feedback effects between the workers and the employer. So wages are not going to change. But what we would expect in the market is the actual shift is not going to be A to B, but A to C, which is higher wages, a smaller decline in working hours, higher incomes for workers, and a lower overall government spending cost of this program. So that is a significant amount of bias, because as we know from UBI theory, what the actual outcome depends on the elasticities of these. So if you have a very inelastic demand for labor, all it would happen would be wages would go up and there'd be no change in employment. And if you had inelastic demand for labor, wages go up. If you had very elastic demand for labor, you would have just what the experiment predicted, which is no change in wages, but a decline in output. But what can happen is anything in this shaded area, when the likelihood is that the effect on wages and hours worked is going to be somewhere in this rectangle, but yet our estimate is going to be over here. That's a highly biased estimate. That is a huge problem. And then, of course, the question is, well, what are you going to do about it? So what do you do about that bias? And well, they are several things you can do about it. Well, let me get to some of the other problems here. That, of course, that is just one kind of feedback effect or community effect that is being ignored by these experiments. It's only one, and there are many others. The effect on education. How does it affect you when what we're looking at, if we're looking at, say, the educational attainment of children, when their family has a basic income, that kid is better fed, that kid is more safely housed, that kid very often does better in school. But all of their classmates are just as poor as they were before. what if they all had a basic income? How would that change the school? That's a community effect. The experiments cannot measure it. And another one is ghettoization. Very often, low-income people live in low-income neighborhoods where there are many poor people, and they are affected by all of the desperation and the problems that are associated with poverty on a community basis. There's more crime, there's more fear, there's more violence, and there's often more targeting by police, blaming the poor who they suspect of being the cause of problem. If you have an experiment and you give a basic income to one poor person in this ghetto, they're a little less poor, but they still live in a ghetto. They live in a ghetto with other people who are just as desperately poor as before. How would that interaction change? Experiments will not show this. Culture. UBI could change the culture, and it could change the culture in ways we don't know. There could become a culture of people who sit out of the labor market. Maybe it would then increase those labor market effects. Or maybe it could be a culture of people who like to be go-getters and try to move themselves up in different ways. We don't know how it will change the culture, and experiments cannot measure it. So what are your options of dealing with community effects? Sadly, the most popular option has been to effectively ignore them. To report, you will find in many discussions of UBI, even in the economics and sociological literature, you will find people talking about the difference between the control group and the experimental group without discussing at all how these estimators we have are actually a highly biased estimate of what's going to happen, because in the real world, because of community effects. They will simply ignore it, and just report and talk about this. You'll find them just talking about these as if these are unbiased estimates of what's actually going to happen when we introduce this. That's one way to handle it. That is the worst way to handle it. Another way to handle it is to pretty much ignore it, but include some caveats. So somewhere in the paper, you'll say, well, actually, these estimates are biased for this reason. And you'll find some that you think they're ignoring it, but then somewhere in the paper, you find there's this little paragraph or maybe even a footnote where this paragraph or this footnote where they're saying, okay, well, actually, it's a bias estimate. It would actually be more like this. And that often can end up being just like ignoring it, because the audience their eyes tend to glaze over when you give them a bunch of caveats of how this estimate you have isn't really that accurate or isn't that unbiased. And their eyes glaze over. Get to the estimate. I want the estimate. Tell me what you found. So you can say it, and it can hard for people to find. But even if people find it, they might not understand it, or they might not pay that much attention to it. Caveats are a problem. Well, another thing you can do is use computer simulation. You can bring in estimates for how these things are likely to affect the market. So when you think about that graph, we have an estimate of the horizontal shift in the demand curve. We say, well, what do we know from other sources, what the elasticities of demand and supply probably are? And then we can say, well, given that, we'll plug our findings from the experiment into this computer using these parameters from this other data and come up with an estimate for the equilibrium point. That will get you an equilibrium point that is less biased. However, it has a problem that's only as good as this information from these other sources. But what we're looking for is experimental information. We wanted to find out these are actually things we would like to learn from an experiment. We'd like to improve those estimates from an experiment we can't. So we have to bring in pre-existing theory. And then, so that brings you to this other problem, is that then what you're actually reporting is not just information from the experiment, but it's a combination of experimental and theoretical information, and the extent to which what you're actually reporting is experimental data, is experimental findings, is actually kind of water, and it's less and less about an experiment, and it's more about the assumptions of your computer simulation model. It's more based on pre-existing theory. Another thing you can do is conduct a saturation study. Saturation study will get some community effects, but not others. The Manitoba experiment, which we'll talk about, had a saturation study, and it was dubbed by Evelyn Forget the town without poverty. And they did find community effects on education and schooling and even mental health, mental hospitalizations for mental health problems. However, as I've warned, a saturation study catches some community effects, but not others. If you give a little town of 1,000 people in rural Manitoba a basic income, that's not going to affect wages in that little town the same way if you gave every Canadian from the Atlantic to the Pacific to the Arctic, if you gave them all a basic income. Another thing there, so then a fifth thing you can do with it that I don't really mention in the book, there's a fifth way to handle it, is handle it on an ad hoc basis, which is essentially what I've done here so far. Oh, this needs to be, let's see. You can handle it on an ad hoc basis, which is to say, okay, this is our estimate, but this estimate is the horizontal shift in the paper. So what actually we're expecting, this is like the largest possible drop we would expect in employment, and the largest increase we would expect in tax costs. We'd actually expect the actual drop in employment to be lower. We'd expect the actual increase in incomes for the recipients to be higher, for wages to go up, and for therefore the tax costs to not be as high as we're thinking of. All of those things you could say on an ad hoc basis, which gives people some idea. And which of these are best, I do not know. I cannot tell you which of these are best. This is something for people to decide. It different. Well, I can tell you which one's worse, but what's best is going to be determined by a lot of different factors. Okay, so that's the first big problem with these effects. A second one, a big problem. The first big problem is community effects. Second big problem is what we call Hawthorne effects, also called observer effects. People's behavior changes when they know you're watching. That is even true in a vaccine study. You might get Hawthorne effects in a vaccine study. So let's say you all are some of the first people to get the COVID vaccine. You're in this trial, and you know everybody's watching to see if you get COVID. Well, maybe you're going to be a little more careful. You're going to be a little more careful because everybody's watching you. They're going to know, you know, all these researchers going to, oh, you got COVID anyway, huh? So you're going to be a little more careful. So that might affect your behavior. And that's one reason why it's often better, even if you're going to have a saturation study, to have a control group be an actual group of people, not just comparing it to the national average. This was a problem, or with saturation study or not. This is a problem in Finland. Finland did a study where they took people who were on long-term unemployment insurance and made them get a basic income instead. There was no choice. They were randomly selected out of all the people in the country who are on unemployment insurance. Randomly selected them, gave them a basic income, and said, you got to live with this basic income for the next 2 years, see what you do. And they did what they did. The control group was not a similar size group. The control group was just the natural average. So the experimental group knew they were being observed. The control group didn't know they were being observed, didn't feel like they were being observed. That was millions of people all across Finland. The other was 1,000 people who'd all been told and briefed on this. So you got Hawthorne effects for the experimental group, not for the control group. At least in a vaccine study, you're going to get Hawthorne effects for both groups. That's why I think it's important, even if you can't do random assignment, if you're doing a saturation study, to have, if you're going to give a basic income to a small town, also pick one other small town and observe them so both towns know they're being observed, rather than comparing this one town to the national average. And there are a lot of reasons why Hawthorne effects happen. They can happen sometimes because people think they want to help the researcher. Oh, this researcher supports basic income. I'm going to behave in ways that will lend support to basic income. No, we're trying to study basic income. We don't want you to change your behavior to helping or harming. They might also want to harm the research. They might. But then also, I think one of them is the feeling of being judged. People are watching my behavior. They are judging me. I want to behave in ways that make me look smart, or make me look moral or intelligent or friendly or whatever. Maybe I want to craft an image or something like that. It could just be the power of suggestion, just knowing somebody's out there looking. And this is probably a bigger problem nowadays than before, because social media and electronic media, people are going to want to share on social media what they're doing, and they're probably going to share stuff about this test. But this is going to make them even more heightened their observance. But also, the existence of these things makes it easier for bloggers and journalists to track down participants. Oh, there's a study going on in Finland. Well, I'm going to track down some of the people in it and interview them. Well, that will heighten the Hawthorne effect on those people. Anu.
So is there an ethical issue related with doing an experiment but not telling the people what you're trying to, what kind of experiment you're trying to do?
Yes, that's a big ethical issue. I have never conducted an experiment with human subjects, and we get a questionnaire every year. Are you conducting any research with human subjects? And I'm glad I've skipped that part. So I actually haven't paid much attention to that issue. But yeah, that is a problem. You generally, what you want to do when you have an experiment is to get the people who are subjects to it on the side, but not on the side of yes or no basic income, but on the side of we want to study this. So if I were doing it, what I would do is, if I were doing a saturation study, I would try to recruit 2 towns or 4 towns or something and observe them for a year before it starts. Observe all 4 towns and try to get them all on side. This is what we're doing, and this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is what we're studying. And then at the a year later, I would have a random draw where we find out which of these 2 towns are going to be in the study, and then do the study, and then try to get then all 4 of these towns, because they all knew that, maybe they get lucky and get in the one that gets the basic income, maybe they wouldn't, but they're all on side of it. You want to get the people on side, but do that, of course, then you're, of course, heightening the effect. And I think it's very difficult it would be very difficult to not let them know with something as big as a basic income. One of the worst studies in human history was, okay, there have been a lot of bad studies in human history, but a horrible, unethical experiment was the untreated syphilis study in the United States, where they've been giving these treatments for syphilis for so long, they didn't know what syphilis was like if you didn't treat it. So they had one hospital where they said, well, whatever black man comes into this hospital who has syphilis, we'll just give him a placebo and we'll study him for years as they die. That happened. And then there were no Hawthorne effects in that study. That they eliminated the Hawthorne effect by doing something absolutely, utterly horrible. And it's almost impossible. And the thing is, people have to enter an experiment willingly and knowingly. And in order for them to do that, then you've got to tell them what it is, and they're going to know they're being served, and you're going to get Hawthorne effects. And if you don't get Hawthorne effects, you're going to, well, you can very often kill people, as happened in the untreated syphilis study. Okay. What's it? Nihalika. Okay.
So would it still be an ethical issue in poor countries where probably there's no jurisdiction of this cares like about this, like not morally but like in a legal way? Like in poor countries where like usually the government wouldn't really care if people are giving money to people.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm not sure what issue you're getting at here. It's
when I went to America, my
yeah.
professor made me fill out or like take this city program course so that I can I legally have the license to like collect samples from people, but in India we don't have that. So
you don't even need a license. No. Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that could be an issue. That could be an issue of jurisdiction shopping. So I'm going to go out of whichever these low-income countries is going to let me get away with whatever I want to do. Yeah, there's probably some country in the world where you could still get away with an untreated syphilis study. You know, it's probably somewhere you could do that. And it was only black men in the study. I'm sure that was complete coincidence, because there's ridiculous. Yeah, just there's so many examples of horrible racism like that in my country, and we're not the only one. So the one thing good about basic income is you're not denying a life-saving event. Like when you're studying a vaccine, you know, there's actually real risk on both sides. One side, you could have given them this life-saving vaccine and said they're going to go out there and get COVID, and some of them are probably going to die. But the other side, maybe the vaccine doesn't work. They're going to get COVID anyway, or maybe the vaccine has a horrible side effect and they're going to die from the side effect. So both sides of a medical study are taking a huge risk. Whereas in basic income studies, okay, one side gets a basic income, so they're better. Okay, that's you give them money. All right, that doesn't hurt them. The other side, you're not taking anything away from them. You might be asking them to fill out forms. And what they did in the studies in the 1970s was that everybody on both teams, so the control group and the experimental group got a fee for being interviewed once a week or once a month by the researchers, to ask them, how much are you working? Are you doing this? Are you that? Asking them all the questions that they were trying to evaluate things on. And both sides got a fee for that. So even the control group, if you ask the control group to answer all those questions without compensating them in some way, then you would be making them slightly better off, slightly worse off. In other words, I don't think there are a lot of huge, because you're giving people something, I don't think there are a lot of huge ethical downsides to conducting a UBI experiment. Unless you tell them, okay, you're going to get a UBI for the next 3 years, and then they quit their job and spend a bunch of money on education, then you cut it off in the middle, and now they can't get their job back, and they owe this money to the person that they spent. Then you can really hurt people by cutting them off. But if you just give them what they promised, I don't think there's a huge downside. But I haven't looked deeply into the ethics of experiments with human subjects, experimenting on those ethical issues. Okay, another problem is long-term effects. Is that these studies are very short-term. The studies are very short-term, sometimes as short as 2 years. Sometimes the longest one there was kind of funny. It was the Sign Dime study was supposed to be, I think, 5 years. And then they got a grant to take a small subset of the people and do a 20-year study. So 3 years into the study, people were told, okay, you people have been selected for the long-term study. Your negative income tax is going to last, instead of 5 years, it's going to last 20 years. So at 3 years, they, okay, great, I got this for 20 years. Then later, they changed their mind. The government changed their mind and said, okay, we're going to cancel this long-term study. So they warned the people, and they gave them like 2 years notice or something like that. They did give them quite a bit of notice. They did give them quite a notice and shut that up. And that is the most long-term study we have at this point, is this group of people who had a basic income for 9 years, or a negative income tax. They had a negative income tax for 9 years, and for about 6 years in the middle of that period, they were led to believe it last 20 years. That's our longest. Now, Give Directly in Kenya is hopefully going to have a long, their study is open-ended. It might last much longer than that, we hope. Now, so the thing about long-term effects is everything changes in the long term, and the thing is, there are two different ways that it could affect it. Is one, you could say, I've got this negative income tax for 2 years. This is my one chance to take some time off. I'm going to take some time off. So you take more time off than you would if the basic income was there forever. But it could be the other way around. It could be the other way. It could be around, well, I got this negative income tax, but I've got to keep my skills up. And if I just leave the labor market, then I'm not going to be able to get a job when this comes out, because I know long-term unemployed people are much less employable. I'll lose the typical increases that you usually get as you age and stuff like that, or as you gain experience. So I got to keep my skills up, so I won't quit my job. So we don't know whether the long-term effect would be longer, or would lead to more or less unemployment. And of course, similar things affect, we could expect education. The longer it lasts, the more likely, the better the effects on education, on health, and on working conditions and wages. But we don't really know. We don't have experimental data that will show it. That's an inherent problem for all experiments. Every single experiment is, maybe these vaccines, these COVID treatments have some sort of side effect that doesn't show up for 10 years. That's very unusual. I've never heard of any kind of drug that doesn't hurt you at all when you get it and hurts you 10 years later. But if these are different, we can't tell from the experiment. We only can tell 10 years from now. Another important one of these problems. Yes. What? Nihalika.
So wasn't this also ethically incorrect, because they led people to believe that they would get something for 20 years and then cut it off?
Oh yeah, it was, but it wasn't as bad as they did in Ontario. In Ontario, they led people to believe they were going to get it for 3 years, and after, I think it was about a year and a half, they cut them off with something like 3 months notice. There's hardly any notice at all. These people had several years notice. So it wasn't as bad, but yeah, I think those people had grounds for a suit. What's that? Oh no, well, okay. I don't think anybody in the Sime Dime Project sued. But in Ontario, there was a lawsuit, and I don't know if it's been resolved yet. I haven't paid attention to it. Okay, Anna, right? Yeah. I mean, that's something big in the literature, is comparing experimental data to other kinds of data and seeing, do they, is this what we expected from this other kind of stuff? Isn't it? One of the biggest problems, I believe, that we have with basic income studies is what we call the streetlight effect. It's a streetlight effect. And what that problem is that an experiment will naturally draw your attention to whatever it is the experiment can measure, even if what it can measure is much less important than other issues, and even if what it can measure is not a very good representation of what's actually likely to happen. So we said, hey, we got this control group. Look, we got this control group, and we got this experimental group, and here's the differences between them. Look at that. Look at the differences between them. Yeah, but how is the differences between those? How does that actually reflect what's likely to change when we introduce a real UBI? That we would need all these computer simulations and other theory to even get an estimate of, and how accurate would that be? We don't even know. All these other unknowns. It draws your attention to this. The experimental group that, the control group did that. It draws your attention both to the questions it can address and to the answers it gives, even if the questions it addresses are not the most important questions, and even if the answers that it gives are inaccurate and biased. That is a huge problem, because many of the things, as we're going to see when we go through the rest of this course, many of the things that they can measure are really just a small portion of what we really want to know about basic income. And when they do measure things, they very often measure them partially or indirectly or inaccurately or in a biased manner. So but yet it draws our attention to its findings regardless, which I think is the point that Anna brought up is really important, is that you need to compare it with other data. But you also need to do a lot of other things to shine the spotlight on something else, on the other things. And you've got to admit, if a good researcher has to admit the limits of what their research is. And this is a problem because even good people get to believe in the thing that they're doing. They have it's confirmation bias and self-interest bias, and is that you've spent the last 3 years conducting this study. This is a really important study, really interesting things. I'm really excited about this study right here and these numbers that we found. But if you just present it like that, look at these exciting numbers I found. I spent 3 years getting these numbers. You are then likely to ignore, well, what do those numbers really say about what we really want to know about this thing that you've been studying? That's what's important. If you really want to help people use a study to help people become better informed about UBI, you've got to admit the limits of what your research shows. Put that research in context of what you really want to know and say, here's the little tiny contribution that this experiment makes to what you really want to know. That is hard. It's hard to get researchers to do that. But even when they do, it's hard to get the people who are listening to the researchers to really pay attention to that and say, oh, come on, what numbers do you find? Give me your numbers. Give me your estimates. What's new in what you did? They often focus on that. So the streetlight effect is a huge problem. Another problem that is very specific to UBI experiments is that they have difficulty differentiating the effect of the size of the policy that you're studying and the type of policy you're studying. One of the things we really want to know is, basic income is a redistributive strategy. So one of the things we like to know, if we're thinking about, okay, we might want, it would be kind of weird to say, okay, I don't want to do any kind of increase in the redistribution of income and wealth and property unless it's UBI. We're just thinking about UBI or nothing. Those are our options. Either we're going to spend billions of dollars every year on UBI. We're just going to leave everything alone. Those are only two choices. Usually it's like, okay, we're willing to spend billions of dollars on a new policy. Should it be UBI or should it be something else? We want to know what effects. So what effects are determined by it being UBI and what rather than another type of policy. But almost all of these experiments, the control group gets exactly what people are eligible for now. And the experimental group gets the UBI or the NIT. So now then you say, okay, the experimental group behaved different than the control group, but was that because they got money in the form of UBI, or was it because they got more money? So so would some other policy like conditional redistribution, how would that have affected their behavior? So in order to really study that, then you would need another control group. You need really a second control group. You'd need your one control group that's getting the existing policy, your another control group that is getting UBI, and another control group that is getting the equivalent of an equal amount of money spent on an increase in the existing programs. That's really hard to do. And it's really expensive. That's going to at least double the cost of your program, maybe much more than double, because those conditional programs, it's really hard to calculate what everybody's eligible for. And then how do you really know when you're testing them equally? Because they have different administrative costs. So you would want, one of the advantages of UBI is that it has smaller administrative costs than other programs. But exactly how much smaller is uncertain. So exactly what increase in benefits to people is equivalent to an equal amount of money spent on conditional programs as to an equal amount of money spent on UBI is uncertain. So we have enormous difficulty teasing out the effects that are because of size of policy being studied or the type of policy being studied. The only one that I know of that has managed to do this, to actually study one where it was at least roughly the same size, was the Finnish study, where they took people who were already on unemployment insurance and gave them a UBI instead. Now that enormously reduces the size and type problem. The only really issue there is, well, the administrative costs, or what are the costs of phasing out and things like that? Some relatively small amounts, but it does that an enormous sacrifice, because the enormous sacrifice is they're only studying the effect of UBI on people who are already on a long-term unemployment insurance. Well, that's a small subset of the people in Finland who would be eligible if we actually introduced the UBI. And they're certainly not the only people that we're interested in. So when you solve one problem, you create another problem. That's the way social science experiments work. It's always something like that. That's one. So one option for solving the size and type problems is to test it against an equal size alternative. That's a hugely expensive option. Another one is one, you notice this keeps coming up. Use theory and data from other sources. Put your findings in a computer simulation to get an estimate for what the control group would have done with an equal amount of money. That is one way to handle it, and that's probably better than doing nothing, but it also has that problem that once again, the thing that you're actually reporting is less driven by the experiment you just conducted and is being more driven by all these different theoretical assumptions that you put in to make this computer simulation work. When you think of putting together all these different times where I said use a computer simulation, all those many parameters you put in, it's really what you end up reporting is this huge computer simulation with this tiny input from the experiment. So most of it, really, it ends up being mostly a computer simulation report, and less and less of a field experiment report. Of course, you still might have to do it to try to fight the biases inherent in that field experiment. Solving one problem causes another problem. And of course, another thing you can do, and this is a very popular option, very, very popular option for this one, is to ignore the problem. I would say the majority of reports I've read, and I've read a lot of literature on this going back in the 1970s, simply ignores this problem. Does not even attempt to tease out, what effects are being caused by size and what effects are being caused by the type of policy, and doesn't even include a caveat saying, oh, by the way, we don't know if these effects are caused because it's a basic income or just because it's a more generous policy than we used to have. A lot of different ways to make your policy more generous, and they're going to have different effects. Could study those, haven't. Now, okay, those are the biggest problems that I've been able to come up with about basic income, about running a basic income experiment. There are certainly others, but those are the main ones that I'm talking about throughout this class and in the textbook. Those, again, community effects, also called feedback effects, Hawthorne effects, also called observer effects, long-term effects, the streetlight effect, separating the effects of the size and the type of the policy. That's a lot of meat. This is a difficult lecture. Most of everything else we're going to talk about in this class is going to flow from those problems. So make sure you understand them. Hopefully this was just a crystal clear lecture and you all have a full grasp of all these problems just from this lecture, and from the reading, but probably not. But when you're looking back, what reading is really important to look back to, and what lecture, this section, getting to understand these problems. Now, hopefully, when these problems come up again, you're not going to be lost you're not going to be lost because you didn't fully understand it. And actually, hopefully, when it comes up again in specific form, it's going to reinforce and actually help you understand. But it's hard for me to overemphasize the importance of this lecture and the corresponding reading. Now, and I say that this lecture isn't even done because there's another problem, which is what I call the practical impossibility of testing universal basic income. Is that it is a program that defies testing. It defies testing, at least on a small scale. You can, in the broadest sense of the term, experiment with UBI by just introducing it in the country and seeing what happens. That's not a controlled experiment of any kind. That's a policy. That's not even calling that an experiment. But mimicking it on a small scale is really difficult. And as I said, this is end up with two points. What you end up doing is usually one of two things. Either you test NIT as an approximation, as a proxy for UBI, or you test an exaggerated UBI, where you exaggerate the facts. That is the one problem. You're either going to test NIT, or you're actually going to exaggerate how much people would really end up with under a UBI experiment. I'll explain that in a bit. The other problem is what if we gave everyone, from what you know of economics, if we gave everyone in the country 15,000 euros a year, and then we didn't raise taxes on anyone, what do you think would happen? Yeah, you get inflation. We have to raise taxes. We have to raise taxes to counteract that inflationary pressure of UBI. But those taxes are going to affect people's behavior. So and that behavior is going to have lots of community effects. So really what we're testing here is really, at most, it's going to be half of the whole UBI thing. We really want to test UBI. We have to be testing, we have to be testing the net contributors and the net recipients to find out how their income changes and how that affects their behavior before and after it. But no study can do that. Even in Manitoba, in the Mincome experiment, when the town of Dauphin, Manitoba, not to be confused with Dolphin, Minnesota, which is a fictional town that I accidentally make up when I try to talk about Dauphin, Manitoba. Even then, everyone was eligible for a negative income tax, but nobody paid higher taxes. And a substantial number of the people of town would have been paying higher taxes. So actually, what they found, the effects they found on that town represented not only the effects of the negative income tax, but a greater influx of money into this town on average than would have happened if some of them had their net taxes increased. Impossible to study. And you can't do that. You can't force, you can get a bunch of people in a little town to volunteer. It says, yes, our town will have something where a substantial number of the people of town will end up getting extra money from the government for studying. But you'll never get a town to volunteer. Well, half of us are going to get more money and half of us are going to pay higher taxes. You can't run that experiment. So you cannot test the tax portion. You cannot test how the tax are going to come. But you do need to test one part of the taxes. Now, as you know, negative income tax, you get the full amount when your income is zero. And then as your income goes up, it gradually fades out to zero till you get the break-even point. Basic income, you get the same amount regardless of your income, but there's going to be new taxes, and those taxes are going to get higher as your income goes up. And that's eventually going to counteract the basic income and make you a net contributor. The higher taxes you pay are going to actually cancel out the basic income you receive. A basic income really is a form of negative income tax. We don't call it that because negative income tax is so closely associated with this phase-out idea. But basic income is a negative tax in the sense that instead of you paying the government pays you. But if you're paying this basic income and at the same time you're paying income or sales taxes or some other kind of tax, those two things are essentially canceling each other out. And what's really going to affect your behavior is not the full value of basic income, but the basic income minus those taxes. So really, we need to, if we want to get any kind of accurate estimate of what people are going to do under a basic income, we've got to really get them the amount of money that they'd actually get in the end under basic income. Because otherwise we're going to exaggerate how much money all of these net beneficiaries are getting by giving them this full basic income instead of something else. Well, how do you deal with that problem? That if you give everybody a basic income, there's three options I can think of anyway. One is include only people who have zero income, people who would get the full value of the UBI if it were introduced, or nearly the full value. Well, you can do that, but if you do, actually, I'm not sure you can do that, because how many people have zero income for 3 years? Very few. That's a tiny subset of people in a wealthier country. That's a tiny subset of people. And so if you do this, if you do it that way, very often a lot of people are going to just have to drop out of the study. Oh, well, I got a job, got to leave the study. Oh, I got a little bit of money. Oh, I got to drop out of the study. You can't, it's really hard to focus on people. You have to focus on like disabled people. But disabled people already get conditional benefits targeted at the disabled, so that doesn't do any good. So now that is a little more feasible in a poor country, because poor countries also tend to be very unequal. And even some middle income countries like Namibia and India have areas where people have hardly any income. And the difference between their basic income and their basic income plus a little tax on the tiny income they make is going to be negligible. So in a place like Namibia or India, when they targeted very impoverished towns, then they were able to just essentially give these little towns basic income. Great, that works for this town, but those aren't everyone we're interested in. We're also interested in how basic income affects the behavior of people who are getting near the phase-out point. So you really, so especially in a wealthy country, you're going to be dealing people, most of your recipients are going to be like halfway in between. So those people, you've got to find some way to simulate the taxes. And to do that really means, well, what we could do to simulate the taxes, you say, okay, here's your basic income, but now give me the taxes that you would get under the basic income program out of it. So I'm giving you the basic income, but I'm deducting the taxes that I think you would pay under this basic income program. Well, if you do that, that's a negative income tax. So you end up using negative income tax. If you really want to know how it affects the incomes of people in most relatively wealthy countries, you're going to end up testing NIT instead of negative income tax. Or if you ignore the problem and give everybody in your study a full basic income, then, which actually they did in Finland, then you're actually ignoring the fact of that the effect, the net effect that the likely tax increase that's going to come with basic income, you're going to ignore the effect on that behavior, and that will give you biased results. So, so you end up in most cases then, unless you're targeting some of the poorest people in the world, you're going to be using the negative income tax as a proxy. And okay, that is, I guess, that is the end of the first part of this lecture. I mean, that's something. Is it? So, well, I get a little bit of a conclusion here. Is that what we then end up doing is we're testing really half of the effects. We're testing the effects of UBI on recipients only, not on net taxpayers. And that has a problem. The people move back and forth. And people can move back and forth, and you can study, well, whenever they're on the recipient side, we'll see how basic income is affecting them. But whenever they're on the net contributor side, we're not simulating their behavior. We're not simulating how those new taxes are going to affect their behavior, and that's going to affect their overall behavior. We can't measure the feedback loops between the people who have a higher net tax and the people who have a lower net tax. That feedback is missing. Even saturation studies don't solve it. And it also, all of these problems cause problems for communicating the results to non-specialists. I can count on you guys who are working on a master's in economics and who are taking time and studying this and reading up on it and doing different things. I can take you to, I can take it that you're going to grasp this. If not all at once, you're going to grasp this over these coming weeks. You try to give one report of this length of time, the length of time that I've spoken to you, or shorter, and you're reporting on the results of your study that involves every problem that I've mentioned so far. And you're giving this to politicians and journalists and completely lay people who have not studied economics, who haven't studied experimentation, who don't know a Hawthorne effect from a streetlight effect. And you're going to do that. You're going to do that in an hour, and you communicate that in a way they're going to understand it and appreciate it, and you're going to understand both the problems and the data you're showing them, and then the implications that this data has for really introducing this. That is a very difficult problem. Communicating what you've learned to a lay audience when all these problems exist, even if you've done your best to solve all these problems, is a huge thing. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of the lecture. Obviously, I won't get through the whole of the second half of the lecture, but I am going to keep talking for at least another half hour to get through that. But before we do, are there any questions on this part of the lecture before I go on? Okay. If you have questions next time, if you probably some of this will need to germinate a bit. There's just so much here. So many of these problems, and this is what you really need to know for everything else. So let this germinate. Bring me questions on this next week. Oh, by the way, I can't see this screen, and this is where the two people on hybrid will be raising their hands. So a little thing will come up here at the bottom if somebody raises their hand, and if they get desperate, they'll turn their video on, and their face will appear. So if you see a hand go up, or if you see somebody's face appear or something, let me know. Of course, if they're really desperate, they can just, see, there's somebody's face. All right, there's Felix. And also, they can also, if they're really desperate, they can just turn their voice on and say, okay, speak up, Carl. Okay, thanks, Felix. Now you can turn it off again. There we go. So, all right, so on to the next part, which is the negative income tax experiments between 1968 and 1980. These experiments had one advantage over the basic income experiments that have been conducted since 2008. And that is, back then, the basic income guarantee model that was most popular was the negative income tax. Now the model of basic income guarantee that's most popular is universal basic income. Everyone wants to study universal basic income now, but they have to use NIT as a proxy. Back then, people were interested in NIT, so it wasn't a proxy or anything. They were actually studying NIT because they were really thinking about introducing an NIT. Now, I wrote this paper that you read, A Failure to Communicate, about the labor market findings of the UBI experiments. I started working on it in 2001, and I wrote it because I wrote it for several reasons, but the state of the literature on negative income tax experiments, I thought was very poor. That at least the state of understanding of it was very poor. Before my paper came out and Evelyn Forget came out, and also because Evelyn Forget's paper on the town without poverty came out. The understanding of it was very poor, and because no one had really addressed, well, what do these decades-old experiments on NIT have to say about this growing basic income movement going on now? So remember what had happened at that point. There was an initial positive interpretation by most researchers. Most researchers said, we've looked at this, we found a lot of good effects on things like childhood welfare, family welfare, indebtedness, and things like that. And the big side effect that we're looking for, labor market participation, was well within the sustainable range, which is the thing that we're most concerned about. It existed as everyone expected, but it was well within the sustainable range. And so the researchers presented what they found is very positive results. But there was an extreme negative media reaction. And most people who weren't experts on the experiments concluded the experiments showed that basic income was a horrible failure. And writing about basic income, it built up from, it like began in the 60s when we were talking about how do we run an experiment, and then it peaked maybe around 1980 or in the mid 80s as the data was coming out, and then it kind of tapered off into the early 90s. And it never completely went away. There's still people writing about those old experiments now. Like my paper is now 17 years old now, but there's still papers like that that'll do a little retrospective or something, or comparing the old experiments to the new ones. So when I wrote, there was no consensus among researchers about what these said. No interpretation of the meaning of the results for the modern UBI movement that was well done. People were using the results, they were using just reference to these experiments to disparage UBI. Oh, we spent millions of dollars experimenting with this policy back in the 20th century. Let's not revive this idea now. These are all reasons that I wrote this paper. But another one was that I got a fellowship at something called the Scherhoover in Belgium, at the Catholic University of Belgium in Louvain-la-Neuve, Belgium, where one of the gurus of the UBI movement, Philippe van Parijs, was the leader of this institute. And I got there, and I had a 6-month fellowship there where I was able to work on whatever research I want. And he asked me to give like a report on the things that I was thinking about writing about. So when I first got there, I reported to a group of people, all these different, I had like I don't know, 6, 8, maybe 10 ideas of stuff to write while I was there. And he's like, this one, the one about the negative income tax experience, that would really, really help. That'd be really helpful. That'd be really useful. So with his pressuring, I started that in 2001, and it finally came out as a published article in 2005. So it took 4 years from starting to work on it till when it came out. And it came out at about the same time as Evelyn Forget's work and some other stuff. And I said, I think it began to change how we look back at these experiments. I hope it had some effect on that, because now people don't look back at those experiments as being something that necessarily says we shouldn't do basic income. Now, and I'm trying to give my best scientific reassessment and overall assessment of what these experiments imply for today's UBI movement. And I'm trying to do my best job as a scientist. But as you know, I'm also a big supporter of basic income. So what you got to look out for is, does Carl have confirmation bias? Keep that in mind. Everything I'm saying to you, I'm trying to do my best to back it up with evidence-based reasoning, but I won't. Now, at the time that I wrote this, and I think maybe today, there was no consensus on the big things that people argued about. There were 2 big arguments that came out of these experiments. There were a lot of other things that were less controversial. A lot of some of the best results were less controversial. It did things like lower the incidence of low birth weight babies. That's really important. I mean, low birth weight is a sign of malnutrition in the mother while she's pregnant, and a sign of health problems that child is likely to have for the rest of its life. That's a hugely positive result. Pardon me. And even in this paper, I don't talk about those kind of results. I talk mostly about the controversies that existed. The 2 were about the reduction in work hours, how big that was, and what the meaning of it was, and about divorce, its effect on divorce. And I've told you, I really don't think its effect on divorce is really that important at all. But these debates flared up in the late 70s and went through the 80s, kind of tapered off into the 90s, but they tapered off without either side saying, oh, without anybody deciding, okay, this side's right, that side's wrong. That's not, sometimes literature works that way, sometimes it doesn't. This is just, the debate just kind of stopped happening. So I'm looking at kind of some of the last papers that came out as this was tapering off. Hum and Simpson, 1993. Few adverse effects have been found to date. Those adverse effects found, such as work response, are smaller than would have been expected without experimentation. Anderson and Block, also writing in 1993, both of them well after the experiments concluded. Social sciences continue to support the negative income tax in the face of an avalanche of negative results provided by the experiments. Robbins, 1985. Labor reduction of a poverty level guarantee with a 50% average tax rate was 2 weeks per year for husbands, 3 weeks per year for wives and single mothers, and 4 weeks per year. These are all per year for use, children who are living with parents in a household that has them. Again, Anderson and Block, again, 1993, based on figures from Burtness. Taxpayers would have to spend $3 to increase the income of the poor by $1. The rest going to reduction in work effort. Okay, here's how the debate tapered off on the issue of whether it increased divorce. Gronveld, Hanna, and Tuma, 1983, wrote, the NIT plans test to dramatically increase the rate at which marriages dissolve among white and black couples by 40 to 60%. That is excluding what we call in the United States Hispanic or Latin couples, who are at the time were much more likely to be Catholic and much more than blacks and whites in the United States. And that time, the incidence of divorce was much less common among Catholics than it is today. Okay, that's 1983. They say that. Kane and Whitaker, 1990. The NIT plans had no effect on the rate of marital dissolution among the treatment couples relative to control couples. Hannan and Tuma, 1990, responding to Kane and Whitaker, we see no reason to abandon our earlier conclusions based on Kane and Whitaker's criticism. Kane and Whitaker, again responding to them, in response to Hannan and Tuma, we see no need to retract or change anything in our article. So the debate tapers off without really any consensus. Now, I published then when really nobody was publishing on this. So I got to be able to write this paper where no one has seriously tried to attack what I'm saying. At least not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of anybody saying that I got it all wrong in this paper. It gets cited mostly by UBI supporters using it for ammunition on their side. However, that's not necessarily what you want as an academic. As an academic, if you really want to get cited, and citation is what builds your career as an academic, you want to get cited. And in order to get cited, you have to spark controversy. And this is something I've had a problem with my academic career, is that my supporters cite me, but I can't get my opponents to fight back. I've written 2 or 3 books attacking libertarianism, and 2 books, and 2 of those books, and all those books also attack social contract theory. And I can't get social contract theorists and libertarians to attack me back. Anyway, so the labor market findings were what was expected. The experimental group worked less than the control group, as anyone would expect. Now, this was treated as the central question of these experiments, which is which is, it is one of the things people want to know. At that time, they didn't know if you gave everyone a negative income tax. Well, what if 50% of the labor market dropped out? Then it would be unsustainable and it would crash the economy. They didn't know that at this point, and the negative income tax showed clearly that wasn't going to happen. So it was an important question. It's less of an important question now, but it was an important question then. But it was treated as the essential question, when actually many other things are more important. That is not even the effect of the policy. That you don't put a negative income tax or a basic income in place to find out how people work. You put it in to help them. How does it affect the welfare of net beneficiaries? That is really the effect of basic income. These other things, a side effect. How does it affect how does it affect things like low birth weight among babies, nutrition among children, school attainment among children, happiness and well-being indexes among adults? How does it affect these things? How does it affect ghettoization? How does it affect all of the other things? How does it affect their overall income? Everyone expected that the experimental group was going to work less. The question was how much? And of course, another question was, well, how conclusive are these results about how much? And another important question is, how do we interpret how much when people work less? Well, one thing we all need to know is, are so many people going to work so much less that the program is going to fall apart? Now that we learned that's very unlikely to happen. But also, then what is the efficiency cost of this program? And most non-specialists aren't going to understand this, but I expect you economists will understand this, is that the efficiency loss here is extremely hard to measure and usually ignored the true efficiency loss, because they'll talk about the overall cost to people working less because of this program. But that's going to be a combination of income effects and substitution effects. The basic income has no efficiency loss from granting people a basic income because it is a lump sum transfer. We know that lump sum transfers are efficient. The taxes used to support basic income to keep it from causing inflation might or might not be efficient taxes, but the basic income itself is an efficient grant. The phase out of the NIT, the substitution effect of that phase out, that causes an efficiency loss. But those questions weren't well separated. Another important question related to the how much people work is the effect of it on the cost of the program. If people work less, then more people are going to be getting then more people are going to become eligible for the program than they were before. That will increase the cost. But of course, if people who are on conditional programs, if people who are say on long-term unemployment insurance, or people who are on disability decide, okay, well, I don't have these eligibility problems anymore, I can go out and work. If they work more, that's going to lower the cost. But those people weren't usually tested. So we were usually testing people who were likely to work less. But another question of how to interpret this issue of whether people work less is the equity issue. Is it right that the people with low incomes work the amount that they do now? Or should they be working less? Or should they be working more? My belief is that we work the disadvantaged people around the earth way too hard. And that giving them the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to work 60 hours a week at two jobs. I don't want to work 40 hours a week at one job. I want to work 30 hours a week. I want to work 32 hours a week, a 4-day work week, and make a good salary. I'm gonna refuse jobs that if if I can't work 4 days a week without making a decent income, I'll refuse a job. I think that's a good thing. I think that would create a more equal and a better society. You might not all agree with me, but the assumption of most of the people who criticize these results in the media assume that the lower class was working the exact right amount right now, that they should not take an hour off work per week, that 2 weeks a year reduction in work, that's too much. That is a bad thing. It was always treated as a bad thing. So this equity issue, and it was treated as being things like sapping the work ethic. If you work 2 hours a week per year less, or 2 hours? No, sorry, 2 weeks per year less. 2 weeks per year or a couple hours per week. If you work 2 weeks less per year, you are doing something unethical. It's treated that way. Also, it was not very well distinguished between, the researchers didn't do this, but a lot of people did. It was treated that way some research did. Walter Block certainly did, but most of the researchers didn't. But a lot of the people who criticize it just assume that equity standpoint, that any drop in labor force participation by poor people is a bad thing. Now, I have a table. In the paper. Oh crap! Which is over here. Now, I don't want to show you this table because it's too small for you to see. I'm going to move that over to here. This is really hard to do this with two screens. Then I got to move the screen back in the right. I got to find the cursor. Move the screen back where it belongs. Okay. Okay, so this table, which you see on page 62 of the paper, summarizes some of those results across these 5 studies across the US and Canada, and of how much people work less in these various estimates. It was broken down in these 3 categories: husbands, wives, and single female heads. This also represents change in thinking over the last 50 years. Back then, it was assumed that most families, it was beginning to change, but it was assumed that most families would have a primary breadwinner, and that would be the man. And that primary breadwinner, the person who made the most money, that man who made the most money, he would be the head of the household. So the man is assumed to be the head of the household. And for a woman to be the head of the household has to be a single woman with children. Then a woman can be the head of the household. I don't think people would use these terms this way in the 2020s. I would certainly hope not, but that's the way they were using them then. So if you are, they might. If you're a woman with children, you're a single female head. And they found that, and it was true then, that most men were primary breadwinners and most women weren't. Most men made a lot higher wages than their wives. And that was also happening throughout the distribution of income. So it wasn't just that it was the disparity between what this husband and this wife made was often bigger than what the average husband, the average wife made, because they're marrying throughout the system. So when you have that, you found that the work reduction in percentage was usually really small among husbands. Is that husbands, primary breadwinners, often decrease their labor effort very little. Wives and single mothers decrease their work effort a lot more. Now, presumably those wives with children and those single mothers are reducing their work effort to spend more time with their children. So the equity issue is maybe not such a bad thing. Maybe it's not a bad thing if parents spend less time working and more time taking care of their own kids, leaving their kids in daycare. That issue did get some discussion. The thought that some of these men might be taking time off to spend time with children as well is hardly even mentioned. That the men taking time off was usually viewed as a bad thing by lots of people. And I found, let's see, it's hard to summarize what we find here. Now, Robbins, who had a study of studies that didn't address the methodologies of those studies, but combined their estimates as well as it could, taking sample size and other things like that into a sample size, the size of basic income and the take back rate and stuff, the size. He said he found that large consistency throughout these studies. In quoting here, in no case is there evidence of a massive withdrawal from the labor market. He found an average of 5% of men, 21% of married women, and 13% of single female heads, 13% reduction in labor time. So 5% of a 40-hour work week is 2 hours per week. That's the work effort reduction that he found in a study across all the studies. And this is a poverty line guarantee rate, guaranteed income with a marginal tax rate of 50%. So it's combining the substitution and the income effects. And this is to people who are in the range. Most of the recipients of these, their initial income before they got into the study was between half of the poverty line and 150% of the poverty line. And the poverty line in the United States is very low compared to what it is in Europe. That is, they were the near poor. They were people who you would most expect to respond to this by working less. People who already weren't working at all, you wouldn't expect them to work. They couldn't work less. People who are already out of the labor force. They might even have worked more. We don't know. And also people with higher incomes, who you would not expect to work less because of this, were not tested. So this 5% is not represent the horizontal shift of the entire labor curve, but only of the labor curve of this small subset that was studied. And a few things did use computer simulation to try to find out how everyone would react and how the labor market, and this 5% not only does not include the whole labor force, but it does not include the response of employers. When employers then, okay, people are working less, we respond with higher wages, people respond by working more. That is not incorporated in this 5%. So the actual decline in labor effort you would expect would be quite a bit smaller. And the ones that studied that with computer simulation found things in the range, in a much smaller range. I can't find the figure here right now, but it's in these tables. Okay, I feel like I am overwhelming you with information at this point. I could speak for another few more minutes, but I think I will just go to questions here, and then we'll call it a day and take it up from this spot next week. Do y'all have any questions? Anuka, no, Nihalka. Okay, I'm gonna get there. Sorry, we have a cultural barrier. It just takes me a while to learn, but I will get Nihalka. Yeah. Well, I want to get it. Yeah, I want to get it. eventually I want to.
Okay. So in this paper, in the 5 experiments that were conducted in the US and Canada,
Yeah.
why was it that the labor time or the work hours that they considered as the measure? Was it because, so like I read in the paper that it says that the concern was over like the overall change in work hours and the effect on the tax cost of NIT. So like my question is, when I read about the next chapters that we still haven't discussed, but so in the media and India, the goal of the experiment was moved to how it would affect inequality or poverty. But to me, it seems like in these 5 experiments in the US and Canada, goal is about like looking at how it would affect labor time. Was it because of the street light effect, it was the most easily used criteria, or was it because like by the time the experiments in Namibia and India were conducted, there was already theory on how it is feasible, and now the question was like, does it really capture the inequality?
Yeah, that is definitely true. That the main focus of the 70s experiments was on labor effort. I'm not 100% sure why that was. One was they really did want to know this. It was one of the things they remember, as I talked about in the first day, they were really considering it at that time. There was a bill in Congress in 1971 to introduce a very watered down version of NIT, to the point where a lot of supporters didn't consider it was really an NIT. But so it was really under consideration, but this is one of their concerns is, well, is it really going to become unaffordable if we do it? That's one reason. But they did look at other things, and I think another part of it, I think, was the streetlight effect. That's something. It's really easy to tell how much of the control group work, how much of the experimental group work. Really easy to tell. Other things a lot harder to tell. Getting data on the health of children and stuff like that. That could be one reason, but another reason, I think, is maybe politically. The people who conducted the study in India and Namibia and a lot of the later studies learned they learned by experience from these early projects not to be blindsided and not to focus on them, which I hope is true, because that's one of the things that I said in a paper that came out about 2010 about conducting experiment, is to focus on the effects, not the side effects. The effects of it, the benefit to the beneficiaries, to be redundant, the benefit to the beneficiaries in every experiment we've had has been really, really good. So politically, that's what you want to focus on. And if you focus, there's also 2 ways to focus on the labor market effects. You can say one is to, politically speaking, one is to say, well, it was small or it was non-existent. But the thing is, you do that, if you do that, you're kind of playing into the hands of UBI opponents. That's the issue they love to talk about. If you're an opponent of UBI, you love to talk about how much should people work, framed as it's bad if they work less. And even if you say it was really, really small, it was non-existent, well, there's always a policy that will get people to work more than basic income. If you want people to work, if your goal in public policy is to get the low class to work more and more and more, basic income is not going to be the best policy. So you accept that framing. Now, another thing you try to do is try to portray it as a good thing, because it's more power to disadvantaged people. It's a representation of them having more power in the labor force, being able to say, okay, I lost my job, I'm going to spend more time looking for my next job. To really find the right job, that's more power in that person, to portray it as a good thing as long as it's within the feasible range. That I've I've recommended that, and not a lot of people conducting experiments have followed that. When they've talked about labor market findings, they've tended to emphasize the smallness of it rather than the empowering fact of it. Although I'm not the only one that talks about the empowering nature of freeing people from bad jobs and freeing people, especially women, from potentially abusive husbands and partners. Yes, go on.
But when you said politically, like in India, did you mean from the government point of view or from the people who were conducting the research?
The people who are conducting the research,
Because it's privately funded, right?
well, it was okay. They started with private funding, then they got a government grant to supplement the private funding. So it was a public-private partnership, but it was privately led. And it was led by people who really knew the UBI literature. Guy Standing, who's been writing about the guaranteed income since the second wave back in the 70s. He was one of the people that put that together. Also with the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA. And they looked back in the literature and they knew something of what to expect. All right, let's call it a day, and I will see you all next time around.